So in this tutorial, we're going to continue to look at global geopolitical efforts. The syllabus here refers to global geopolitical efforts, recognizing that the source of greenhouse gas emissions may be spatially distant from the countries most impacted. So just to recap here, this is a clear reference to COP21 and the Paris Agreement and the Green Climate Fund was where consensus was found there to fund $100 billion a year. And I'll look at that, I'll just go through that a bit later in the video. But first of all, let's take a look at this idea of recognizing the source of greenhouse gases and then the spatial impacts. So this graph here given to us shows the historical and up to 2070 emissions. And so I've boxed various kind of sections of the graph, and we can see really that largely the historical causes of emissions lie with developed nations. Don't underestimate the European contribution to historical emissions, covered here in yellow, the EU 28 and other European countries, really massive contributions to historical emissions. And of course, USA, a big nation, big populated country and highly developed, has a massive contribution to historical emissions too. You can see it here as it grows. It continues really to be a significant contributor. And then what we're highlighting here then is the growth in kind of NE regions and Southern Hemisphere regions. You can see that all regions of the world are increasing their emissions. The most rapid growth coming in China and other Asia and Pacific nations. So China there, look, outstripping all other countries in terms of its emissions today. First of all, I think what we need to go back to the syllabus link, and here we can see that these historical causes, you can see that we actually accumulate all those emissions. The vast majority of emissions lie with the EU and the USA, and China's still very small contribution, historical, but rapid contribution now. If we have a look at then the pattern of impacts from this, we can see in this graph here produced by Stanford, it's quite striking, isn't it? The Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere, but not quite a north-south divide, really. If you think about what the position of the trough of the equator around this position here. But very striking to see that the worst impacts are going to be felt by Africa, not just sub-Saharan Africa, but generally Africa as a continent, the Arabian Peninsula here, the southern continent here, India, Pakistan, across Southeast Asia and into South America. So these regions experiencing up to a 100% decline in their GDP by 2100. Most regions actually experiencing decline. Western Europe here seeing marginal increases in GDP. And the winners of climate change are these more northern, more Arctic regions. You've got Canada, you've got Scandinavia, Russia, and some Central Asian economies as well. And some of their successes doubling, actually 200% growth in their GDP through to 2100. This is confirmed by this graph produced by the OECD in 2050, the economic consequences of climate change. You can see here that the world decline in GDP in black. So you can see this annual, if you track the timeline here, what we're seeing is annual decline. And by 2060, it reaching almost kind of minus 1.18% or something like that. So significant losses. Europe's not seeing significant losses, but still marginal decline. And then down here, look, where you've got the Middle East and North Africa, you've got South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa seeing massive annual declines in GDP. So kind of confirming the Stanford graph earlier on. And so what might be the social impacts of that? And then we see this graph here that shows mortality rates, again using going up to 2,100, deaths equivalent per 100,000. What's striking here is, again, you see this kind of same regions affected dramatically impacted, increasing mortality. Africa, again, massively impacted by mortality. And we see in red here the worst affected area, the Sahel region of Africa. So, we've got some data here looking at the projection of the Sahel population. It should reach 670 million by 2100. So the Sahel is this band here of nations that cuts across here, south of the Sahara. So 670 million expected to live there by 2100. So if we just take the mid-range of the projection, this would mean that 4 million deaths a year in this region alone as a consequence of climate change. So this region, these regions that we see in orange have done little to contribute to historical emissions, but you can see by far they're seeing the biggest impact. Of course, there are still deaths in Western Europe, United States, and developed nations as a result of climate change. Things like heat stress in the summer due to higher temperatures, of course, increased flooding events and things like that, but majorly due to summer temperature rises and extreme temperature rise affecting the elderly in those regions. So what has been the geopolitical response to this evidence? Well, we go back to COP21 and the Paris Agreement in 2016. So in this agreement, developed nations recognized their position as the greatest source of historical greenhouse gases. We've seen that in the graph earlier. NEEs share some responsibility, especially China. So in terms of today's emissions, China's the biggest contributor to emissions today, so it needs to take some responsibility for that. All countries recognize that body of evidence that Southern Hemisphere nations, developing regions, are going to be worst hit. They're not responsible for those emissions, but will absorb the biggest impact of climate change. And so in the Paris Agreement, consensus was reached around raising 100 billion euros a year through public and private finance. And that's due to start in 2020, the year I'm making this video. And that is to be given over to adaptive capacity building in developing countries. And we call that the Green Climate Fund. Of course, there are major concerns existing. To this date, I'm making this video in July, and we're nowhere near that 100 billion raised. The mechanisms for how that funding is to be raised is very, very unclear. We've since seen the US withdrawal from the agreement, and of course we're right in the middle of this global pandemic, COVID-19, which has caused a massive economic downturn. And so actually how that money will be raised and then how that will be administered and shared among those countries remains just very, very unclear, and it lacks transparency. And at this particular point, I think it would be fair to say there is a lack of sort of national will or motivation amongst countries to think about this 100 billion, because they're dealing with greater problems of their own, national problems to do with the pandemic.